Well, thank you very much, Bob, for your very kind introduction. I appreciate that, and particularly I'm glad that you mentioned John Herford and the Herford Foundation, because John was a good friend to me, I know to many of us, and before his very untimely death, he was very active in the Foreign Policy Association and many other groups, and it was a true loss. And the fact that he has this foundation named after him and continuing his work is really a wonderful living testimony to a really terrific human being. And I want to thank Noel and the Foreign Policy Association for inviting me to this wonderful event. It's really a pleasure to be here. You have so many interesting events and so many good things. It's from my point of view, a pleasure to be a part of this and to have a chance to talk to all of you about a topic that, as Bob said, is important and timely and I think too little discussed. And one of the reasons I wrote the book was essentially because I thought we had not looked. Oh, is it? Oh, I'll move it up. Sorry, thank you for reminding me. I'll lean into it a little bit. Is it better now? Okay, thank you. One of the reasons I wrote this book was to try to go back into American history and see how we'd paid for past wars. Given the fact that I thought this war was perhaps not financed as well as it could be or should be, I thought it might be useful to go back and see how we've done it in the past and see what we could learn from the past that might help us to do a better job with this war or in wars to come. And the title of the book, as Bob suggests, is by no means mine. It comes from Alexander Hamilton, as most good things about American financial history do. Hamilton was a genius and a visionary, and all of us who were involved in the financial world, Goldman Sachs or any other firm, any of us who are involved in business or finance, indeed the entire country owes an enormous debt to Hamilton, because he really was the creator of the American financial system. And but for him, we would not have as strong a financial system or as strong an economy as we do today. The title comes from the statement that Hamilton made in what was called his first report on public credit. And the reason he wrote this report was that during the Revolution, the government, had accumulated a huge amount of debt. Now, the government at that point was the Continental Congress, and it had borrowed a great deal of money to fund the revolution. And the states also had borrowed a lot of money because a lot of the revolution was fought with state militias or state paramilitary people, normal farmers, civilians who were supporting the revolution. And a substantial portion also was borrowed from Europeans, from the French and the Dutch. And Hamilton, at the end of the war, concluded that this new country, this loosely put together confederation of 13 states that in many cases didn't see themselves as part of the country. States were referred to at that point by individuals as their country, not the United States, but if you came from Virginia, that was considered your country. Maryland, that was your country. New York was your country. They didn't really think of the United States as a coherent unit. For many, many years, after the Declaration of Independence and after the Constitution. And Hamilton concluded that in order to appear to be serious to our own citizens and to the rest of the world, this country had to rapidly establish its creditworthiness. And therefore, it had to develop a plan for repaying the Revolutionary War debt, which he called the price of liberty. And that everyone had a role in helping to repay this. So you'd have to pay taxes. Taxes at that point were not income taxes. They were really tariffs, or what they call excise taxes, which we call sales taxes. So that this debt had to be repaid faithfully, it had to be repaid in a timely way, and it had to be repaid in gold. It was all contracted in gold. Hamilton said it had to be repaid in exactly the same medium in which it was contracted, which was gold. And this was controversial, particularly the federal government repaying state debts. That was particularly controversial, but Hamilton insisted that the creditworthiness of the United States depended on the government paying all these debts in a timely way. The second point was that this was important for national security reasons. And here's where the link that appears throughout the book begins to take place, and that is that financial soundness is critical to strong national security. And Hamilton argued that if there were to be another war, as was widely anticipated at the time, either with the French or with the British or maybe with the Spanish, whoever it was with, the government would have to borrow again, as it had during the Revolution, in order to finance the military and to buy equipment and buy weapons that were required and ammunition to fight the war. And unless the United States had established its creditworthiness by repaying the Revolutionary War debt, it would not be able to borrow in the event of another war, because if you haven't paid your first war debt, it's going to be very hard to borrow to pay for another war. You wouldn't be able to do it, particularly in Western Europe, where the creditworthiness of the United States had to be established. Most Europeans saw this as just a new, untried experiment. Many of them didn't think it would survive. So in order to demonstrate that you were a sound credit risk, you had to repay that old debt. And the interesting thing about it wasn't just Hamilton. As those of you who know American history know, Hamilton and Jefferson agreed on virtually nothing. They were bitter rivals. They were in Washington's cabinet, but they were bitter rivals. But on one item they did agree, and that was the importance of the creditworthiness of the United States for national security reasons. Jefferson had said earlier that if he had one amendment to put in the Constitution, it would be an amendment preventing the government from borrowing any money. Jefferson did not like debt. He thought that was a bad thing. He thought it pitted taxpayers against bondholders. It would be very divisive for a Republican, a new government. But on one issue, he and Hamilton agreed, and that was that the government had to be creditworthy, because he also anticipated there would be another war. Jefferson, thought it would be with Britain. Hamilton thought it would be with France. But nonetheless, they both agreed that unless the new government were able to borrow, it would lose, the country would lose, and would be taken over by one of the great powers, in part because you really couldn't raise taxes very much. Don't forget, the Revolution had been fought against British taxation, and therefore the new government, they both agreed, would find it very hard to raise taxes in the event of another war to the extent needed to pay for that war. So the ability to borrow abroad was central to establishing the creditworthiness of the country and to the national security of the country, borrowing in the event of another war. Well, this tradition of paying down wartime debt after a war was a critical element of American policy up until the 1960s. Every war that the United States fought, a certain amount of borrowing took place, and then the government, the Congress, and the President worked together to eliminate or reduce to the extent possible the wartime debt in as short a period of time as possible. After the War of 1812, a lot of borrowing took place, the debt was reduced. After the Civil War, there was a huge debt accumulation by the Union. What happened during the Civil War was the highest debt level the country had experienced prior to that was about $100 million. At the end of the Civil War, the debt of the Union was $1.3 billion. Now, that was a lot of money in those days, $1.3 billion. Virtually no one thought it could be repaid. This was considered so large, and many people said, well, we don't need to repay this. This was incurred in fighting a civil war. People will excuse the fact that we're not going to repay this debt. And America's leaders at the time, basically, Lincoln, of course, was dead just after just before the war ended. Many of the leaders of the time were quite adamant that this debt had to be repaid and cited the Alexander Hamilton example that, we're not going to be free from wars in the future. The Union has to demonstrate that it's credit worthy and repay this debt as soon as it possibly can. And to dispel all doubts, they did something which was remarkable. If you go to the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, it says something very interesting. It says the debts incurred by the Union in putting down this insurrection and rebellion shall not be questioned. This was ingrained in the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, lest there be any doubt at all in the Congress or among the creditors of the Union this would be repaid. This was put in the Constitution to give people the assurance that it would be repaid. And just for good measure, they did something else. They said that all debts incurred by the Confederacy would be illegal. So they made a sharp distinction between Confederate debt, which was called, but put in the Constitution as illegal. You couldn't, if you were owed money or you were a Confederate, you had lent money to the Confederacy, you had no redress in Washington to get your money back. In fact, also, a lot of people in the Confederacy said, well, what you did was you destroyed our property, you freed our slaves, you destroyed our plantations, we want redress. It was put in the Constitution that none of those debts would be repaid, no restitution for anyone in the South for any losses of what they called their property. It was very clear what the requirements of the Union were and what they were not. And this establishing or reestablishing the creditworthiness of the country after the Union was considered after the war was considered critical. Other things that occurred during the Civil War were almost equally remarkable. Before the Civil War, there was no income tax. The only taxes, as I mentioned, were excise taxes or sales taxes and tariffs. Once in a while, there was a direct tax on wealth like farms or property, but never an income tax. During the Civil War, an income tax was imposed. And I'll describe in a little while why that was the case. But it was a new innovation in the Civil War. Also, we had never had a national banking system before the Civil War. The banks were all state banks. During the Civil War, they established a national banking system because they wanted to pull the Union together to prevent fragmentation of the Union. There were a lot of parts of the Union that didn't want the war, that in fact were not particularly enthusiastic, including New York, where this was a hotbed of anti-Union sentiment in New York, believe it or not, for a variety of reasons, many of which were that merchants on Wall Street had lent a lot of money to Southerners, and they were particularly happy that the Southerners were not going to be able to pay it back and that the North was ultimately going to prevail over the South, as most people anticipated. So, and the last thing that was particularly innovative was we'd never had a paper currency before the Civil War. The greenback was established during the Civil War. It was called a greenback because they had a surplus of green ink, and that's what they used to print the currency. And the Confederate currency was called bluebacks because the South, they had a surplus of blue ink. That's how it came about, and we've used the greenback with green ink ever since up until recently, where it's changed a little bit. But the whole point is that during the Civil War, there was such an enormous need for money, borrowed money, taxed money, creation of currency, creation of a banking system to create money, in effect, that they resorted to all these very innovative measures. And the interesting thing about it is these people knew very little about finance. They were people who came from various parts of the country, mostly from very small towns. The Speaker of the House was from Indiana. Morrill, who was the chairman of the Tax Committee of the Ways and Means Committee, he was a store owner in Stafford, Vermont. These people came, they had almost no knowledge of finance. Chase, who was the Treasury Secretary at the time, was a well-known guy who was a lawyer. He was called the lawyer for fugitive slaves, a very strong abolitionist, knew very little about anything to do with finance. And yet the remarkable thing is these people put together a remarkably modern financial system that bears a very close resemblance to what we have today. We had an income tax for the first time. We had paper currency, national banking system, the Internal Revenue Service. We didn't have one before the Civil War. Civil War one was established. So it was a very modern system. And again, as I say, after the war, debt was repaid. And the same thing happened after World War I. There was a lot of debt accumulated during the Roaring '20s. A lot of it was paid off because revenues were very strong. Even after World War II, where debt reached 110% of GDP, all-time high. After the war, within 5 years, it was cut down to 60%. And even during the Cold War, because Truman and Eisenhower were fiscal conservatives, there was an attempt to avoid an accumulation of debt during the war. During the beginning of the Cold War, there was some, but it wasn't a lot. They all understood this, and one of the points they all kept making was we owe it to our posterity not to saddle them with a large amount of debt. Washington, in his farewell address, made a very fundamental point. The thing we remember about his farewell address is no entangling alliances. But he said something else that we forget, and that is that the current generation, that was his generation, should not ungenerously, as Washington put it, throw the debt which we ourselves ought to bear onto the next generation. And this was quoted time and time again in the Congress and by future presidents, that we shouldn't throw the debt that we ourselves should bear on the next generation. And that was, even Eisenhower, as late as Eisenhower, he made these points about our posterity, future generations, not burdening them with a lot of debt. So the one theme that really goes throughout the financial history of this country up into the 1960s was if you incur debt during a war or any emergency, pay it down as quickly as you can. It's the honorable thing to do. It's good for national security, and it also is good in terms of making sure that you're not burdening the next generation. And that was one theme. It got lost in the 1960s, and it got really lost during the Vietnam War, and we really haven't quite captured that again. Very few politicians make those kinds of references today. The second element of wartime financial strategy had to do with sacrifice. This was a common theme up until very recently, that when the troops are fighting abroad, Americans at home should give up something, should give up either through higher taxes or through cuts in domestic programs, or in some wars rationing, in some wars price controls. There should be, while troops are sacrificing abroad, Americans should make some sacrifice at home. And the interesting thing is that this really was true. Abraham Lincoln would go around the country trying to sell war bonds. He said anyone of modest means should buy these war bonds to demonstrate two things. One, that you were supporting the Union troops who were fighting in the Confederacy, and the second thing was that you were binding yourself to the Union, that wartime financing was seen as a way of engaging people, engaging Americans on the home front in the war effort. There was something they could do. It was pulling them into the war effort, so they were part of the Union effort in supporting the troops and encouraging the country to come together behind the war effort. And this was true during World War I. It was even more so during World War I because World War I cost even more than the Civil War. And you had a very interesting character who was Treasury Secretary at that point, a guy named William Gibbs McAdoo. Now, for New Yorkers, William Gibbs McAdoo has a particularly unique role because he was the guy, his company was the company that established the path tunnels. They were called McAdoo's Tunnels. He was born in Tennessee, very poor family, very entrepreneurial lawyer, came to New York, hated Wall Street. He thought Wall Street was a lot of elite, fancy people, and he was a down-home guy from Tennessee. But he became very successful. He was a very well-known lawyer, and he started this company that built the paths. There had been no tunnels before, and his company did this. And he was a very innovative, entrepreneurial person. Wilson selected him because he was a Southerner. Wilson, we forget, was a Southerner. He was from Virginia, although he'd been governor of New Jersey. They were it was the first Southern president we'd had since the Civil War, since President Polk in 1846. So it was sort of the Southerners were coming back, very patriotic people, sort of pulling the South back into the Union. And McAdoo made a very interesting set of points. He said, paying for war is the equivalent of capitalizing patriotism. That was his slogan. And what did it mean? It meant war bond rallies. They had what they called Liberty Bonds. There were 7 Liberty Bond drives throughout the war. Every little town had a Liberty Bond drive. Small towns of a couple hundred people would have Liberty Bond drives, and they'd bring people together in the town square, and the mayor or in some cases, an entertainer would come and rally people to buy bonds for the war. And McAdoo made the point that if you're sending your fathers or your sons off to fight in the trenches of France, which was where most of the war was, you should at the same time support them by buying war bonds and in some cases paying your taxes. Most people didn't have to pay taxes, but some did. So there's a notion of engaging people that if your sons or fathers or husbands are out there fighting, you should be involved. And he would engage people in the war process to show the country was supporting them and to pull them in, to make them, as he put it, more war-minded. And this notion of sacrifice, this notion of engagement of the country behind the war effort was considered a critical element of war financing. It wasn't just about raising money. Obviously, you needed a lot of money to fight a war. But it was also about giving people a sense that they were participating in the effort, that they were doing something. World War II, very much the same thing. World War II, you had Morgenthau from upstate New York, who was the Treasury Secretary. Of course, Roosevelt was from New York as well. They also had these bond drives, war bond drives. They were called Series E bonds, and they would do them for very small amounts. Obviously there were large bonds, $1,000 or $10,000 units, but there were also, if you were a school child, you could bring a nickel in to your class every week, and you get what was called a war stamp. And when you got 5 war stamps, you got a page, and when After a while, you could get $5 worth of war stamps, and you could get your very own bond. So again, it wasn't about raising money. This is a very small thing, but they wanted to engage everyone, children, adults. There was a payroll savings plan, so that which actually continues to exist today. So you could get your money deducted for your war bonds from your paycheck and accumulate bonds. So it was a way, in part, was a way of engaging people. It also was very useful in holding down inflation, since it skimmed off purchasing power. But it was really about engagement as well as about raising money. And Roosevelt, the interesting thing about it, there was no mincing of words that this was going to be a cheap war. There was no attempt to soft pedal the cost of the war, nor was there in World War I. Roosevelt goes before the Congress at his first State of the Union speech after Pearl Harbor and said, war costs money. And that means taxes and bonds and taxes. It means everyone has to give up something. It means you have to give up luxuries, you have to give up ordinary goods. This is what we need to do in order to pay for this war. And he said something else that was very powerful. He said, we don't just want to achieve a superiority in weaponry. We want a crushing superiority in weaponry. It wasn't an attempt to soft, well, maybe we can get by with this, maybe we can get by with that. That was not enough for Roosevelt. He wanted to make sure that the United States and its allies had, as he put it, this crushing superiority. Now, why did he do this? He understood, first of all, that the country was still, in many cases, very, very isolationist. Had it not been for Pearl Harbor, there's a chance we wouldn't even have engaged in this war. Pearl Harbor obviously plunged us into the war very rapidly. But it's useful to remind ourselves that 8 months prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor, there was a vote on the draft. It passed by one vote, 203 to 202. There were a lot of people at the time who said, we don't want a draft. If you get a draft, then Roosevelt surely is going to drag us into this war. Roosevelt was only able to get things like Lend-Lease and some of these other programs through with enormous difficulty, because a lot of people figured the more support you give to the Allies, the higher the probability we're going to get dragged into this war. And so people didn't want to pass a draft. And there were a number of people who felt, even after the war began, that there were a very high casualty rate. Americans would say, that's enough. We don't want this. We want to pull out. Now, this was certainly not the majority, but there were still people around. There were Lindbergh, America Firsters, a number of people. And Roosevelt was always worried. So he wanted to make sure there was a sufficient superiority in weaponry that it would hold down casualties, and that if we were superior in weaponry, we could provide weapons to our allies, and they could do a large share of the fighting, which again would hold down American casualties and therefore help to avoid this backlash of isolationism, which he feared. And that's really what he did. So he went to the American people and said, you got to pay for this. This is going to be a large amount of money. The bill is going to be high. Never an attempt to soft pedal it. Went directly to the people. And he would give these fireside addresses from time to time. He didn't give that many of them. They're quite famous because he was so candid with people about what the requirements of the war were, how much they had to pay, why they needed to support the troops. And Americans did. There was an enormous outflow of patriotism, and all these isolationist tendencies over a period of time evaporated. But it was by no means a sure thing. It was really Roosevelt's brilliance as a leader that enabled that to occur. Then you get to the Civil War, to the Cold War, and the Cold War was particularly interesting in the following sense. If you look at the Cold War, what happened during the Cold War and the way the Cold War was financed was very unique. Prior to the Cold War, we had periods where you have mobilization, demobilization, war and peace. The war begins, you mobilize your troops. The war ends, you demobilize the troops, they go home, wartime spending drops dramatically. The Cold War was very different in that it was a sustained war. There was no beginning, no end, or at least there was not an anticipation it would end. There was a feeling this was going to last for a long time. Eisenhower thought it would last, as he put it, indefinitely. So the early in the beginning of the Cold War, the first few years of the Cold War, conservatives actually put restraints on the military budget, because there was a feeling among these people that the Soviet Union's goal, and we don't know whether this was accurate or not, but there was a feeling at the time that the Soviet goal was not to fight a third world war with the United States. It was to cause Americans to think that there would be a third world war, and to exhaust itself in what was called then preparedness. That is to say, the U.S. would spend so much money in trying to prepare for this Third World War that it would encounter a resistance among the American people, because the budget deficit would increase dramatically. There'd be another outburst of inflation, as there was right after World War II. And then Americans would say, look, we want a period of normalcy. We don't want to spend a lot of money. If the Soviets want Eastern Europe, if the Soviets want Greece, and the Soviets want Turkey, if the Soviets want to keep their ally in Korea, that was North Korea, why should we worry about it? A number of people thought the Soviet Union was still the ally of the United States. It had been in World War II. And it really wasn't until, first of all, Churchill, when he gave a speech in Missouri, the Iron Curtain speech, many people thought this was alarmist. And there were people like George F. Kennan and a number of others who said, you got to do a lot to resist these people. You got to contain Soviet power. Many Americans thought that was overly alarmist, and even if it wasn't, they didn't want to spend a lot of money doing it. So early in the Cold War, you get a lot of people, including the people in the military, saying, let's hold down military spending, hold it to the point that we need to spend in order to counter Soviet pressure, but not so much that it leads to big budget deficits, a lot of inflation, and then Americans simply say, we're not interested in paying this high price. We want to, in effect, back off, and we don't want to keep our troops in Europe. We don't want to do the kind of things that are required in terms of foreign aid to resist the Soviet Union. So the first period of the Cold War was about finding the optimum level of military spending to avoid a big blow-up in the budget and avoid inflation, but to provide enough money so that you could resist the Soviet Union where it needed to be done, which was Greece and Turkey and Berlin and places like that. So Truman and Eisenhower both had to walk this very fine tightrope in terms of the right amount of military spending, not overdoing it and not underdoing it. Well, the irony of all this is it wasn't the United States that became bankrupt over the Cold War. Ultimately, it was the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was, in large measure, because their economy simply didn't function as well as that of the United States. It was strong in the 1950s and early 60s, but after that, it weakened substantially. And as a result, when you got to the Reagan era with a lot of military spending, the Soviets tried to keep up and couldn't do it. And one of the very interesting quotes is the head of the Red Army in Afghanistan, who said, we're going to have to pull out of this place. He told an American who turned out to be a CIA agent that this was the case. We're going to have to pull out because we simply can't outspend the United States, and therefore we can't sustain the war in Afghanistan or the Cold War in general. This was one factor that caused the end of the Cold War. Not the only one, but certainly one of them. Well, the irony is this takes you right into the war on terrorism, because Osama bin Laden saw what was going on in Afghanistan and concluded that it wasn't the United States that had caused the Soviet Union to go bankrupt, as bin Laden put it in October in a speech in October 2002. He said it was the fact that the armed militias, the resistance in Afghanistan, had caused the Soviet Union, bled the Soviet Union to the point where it couldn't continue the war and had to pull out. So his conclusion, bin Laden's conclusion, was that it was not the United States that did this, it was the forces, the liberation forces, as he put it, who were fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan. And therefore, when it came time to take on the United States, bin Laden concluded the same thing, that we have the chance now of bleeding the United States. We're going to engage the United States in acts of terrorism around the world and on its own territory, so that over a period of time, the United States will have to spend so much money in preparing itself to fight terrorism, and so much money if we strike the United States, as occurred after 9/11, that the American economy would collapse, as the Soviet Union had. Now, bin Laden was not as familiar with the details of how the American economy worked relative to the Soviet economy, but that was one of the conclusions that he'd come to, that when you go after the United States, if you do this relentlessly, if you go after American infrastructure, as he put it, the 9/11 cost the United States something in the order of $1 trillion, and it cost Al-Qaeda $500,000. So we can do this a lot. We can afford it. The United States can't. We'll weaken their economy. what happened, and this really brings me sort of to the end of this story and brings it up to where we currently stand, and that is that if you look at the way the war has been financed, the Iraq War and the broader war on terrorism, we really haven't learned the kind of lessons we should have from the past. In particular, we haven't learned the lessons about wartime financial leadership and wartime leadership in general. Consider the following. After 9/11, there was no call from the president for any kind of sacrifice, no act of fundamental leadership that would mobilize the country behind the war on terrorism. It was a terrible thing. The president made the right statements about Afghanistan and going after al-Qaeda and going after the Taliban. And I think most Americans widely accepted that. But think how much better it would have been had he also used that to call upon Americans, for instance, to support a bold energy bill. The terrorist came from the Middle East. Much of the terrorist money came from the Middle East. The Middle East is an area that's very vulnerable to acts of terrorism. And our allies there are vulnerable. That would have been a great opportunity to say this is a moment where the United States should pull together and come up with bold energy policy. That didn't happen. Or if that wasn't sufficient, or even if it was, it would have been a great opportunity to say, look, we're going to have to spend more money now in fighting terrorism. We're going to have to spend money for homeland defense. We're going to have to spend money in Afghanistan and chasing terrorists around the world. Americans, if we're really in the middle of this war, this mortal struggle with terrorism, Americans should do something to support it, including, for instance, a moratorium on earmarking, on pork barrel spending, or some reduction in non-essential domestic spending, something to demonstrate that Americans were giving up something to support this effort to deal with the war on terrorism. And the same thing in 2003 with the war in Iraq. The war in Iraq, lest we forget, initially was a very popular war. It's turned out to have been bumbled so badly that it's no longer a popular war, but it was at the time. You look at the votes in the Congress; they reflect that. So at the beginning of the Iraq War, he could have said, "Look, we should give up something to make room in the budget for additional military spending for the Iraq War. Make room in the budget to be sure that our troops are well armed, our troops are well protected, that they have proper body armor, that their Humvees are properly fortified, that when they come home they're getting the proper medical care, that when their families send their sons and daughters or husbands and wives abroad, they don't have to go on welfare." Things of that nature, some measure of sacrifice. But the problem with this is that where does the sacrifice come? It's come from the troops, it's come from their families. The average American has been treated to a tax cut, and domestic spending programs have been going up. They're going up less rapidly now, but they're still going up. So there was no sense of engaging Americans behind the troops fighting the war, as there had been in World War II, the Korean War, World War I, Civil War, and other smaller engagements. And what's troublesome about this is the future. It's not so much that we can't pay for this war today. The budget deficit is only $150 billion. This war, when you look at it, is about 1% of GDP. World War II was about 35 to 40%. Korean War was about 12 to 15%, and Vietnam was about 10% on an annual basis. This is much easier to manage. But the difficulty going forward is that we're going to be in a period in the next decade when it's going to be much harder to meet our national security requirements. And why is this? It's because in the next decade, first of all, as after Vietnam, there's going to be a feeling among a lot of people, the military budget's too high, we've got to cut it back. When we leave Iraq, as we almost surely will at some point, there'll be people say, all right, we want a big peace dividend. We want this money to go to something else. And there's some merit in that. The only question is how far that pendulum swings back. After Vietnam, it swung back very rapidly and very far. The second is that there are a lot of unmet needs of the military. Don't forget the military, so much money has been sucked out of the military for the Iraq War that a lot of new weapons haven't been purchased. And in fact, it's going to take 2 years to bring the normal equipment of the military back to where it was in 2003 because weaponry is used up, a lot of tanks and helicopters and things are worn out, some of it's been destroyed. So bring the military back up to where it has been is important. Third, looking after the wounded. They're going to take a lot of care. It's going to be very expensive for a long period of time. Many of these people are badly wounded and need government help, VA help for their whole lifetimes. And fourth, don't forget, with the notion that the best defense is a good offense, we have spent a lot of money for the Iraq War and cut back or simply underfunded a lot of the Homeland Security recommendations of the 9/11 Commission report. In fact, in doing this book, I talked to Hamilton and Kane and a lot of the members, and they all said, these are conservatives and liberals both, a lot of things that we thought needed to be done to shore our Homeland defenses up, we didn't do. And the last two risks are, one, entitlements. Entitlement programs are going to swamp the budget in the next decade. Now, you'd have to reform those. Well, even if the military budget were zero, they would have to be reformed because they're unsustainable at current levels. They will take all the revenues of the federal government just to finance entitlements in the year 2020 if the current rate of growth continues, which means there won't be money for anything else. Now, clearly this is inconceivable, but if you want to avoid that, either you have to reform them or taxes are going to have to go up dramatically, which slows the economy down, or we're going to have to borrow more, which pushes up interest rates and again slows the economy down. So some reform of entitlements is going to be needed just because they themselves are unsustainable, but also if you want to have a reasonable amount of money for national security, for international and domestic security, you're going to have to make sure that there's sufficient room in the budget to pay for that. You can't have entitlements sucking all that money away. And the last point is that we're very vulnerable with respect to foreign capital. We're more dependent on foreign capital today than we were during Hamilton's period, when he was so concerned about ensuring that we were seen as creditworthy in the eyes of the rest of the world. And the problem is we're reliant very heavily on low-cost capital from the rest of the world to finance our budget deficit and to finance a large portion of our economy. We borrow and receive in other forms something in the order of $700 to $800 billion a year from the rest of the world, 7% of our GDP. This is all fine as long as it continues to come here. But suppose there were to be another terrorist attack, and suppose that took place at a period of time when we had a budget deficit, a large budget deficit, we would be in a much weaker position to attract that foreign capital. People who are buying stock might say, well, your economy is weakened, there's a terrorist attack, it's going to cause the budget deficit to rise further. We're going to be much more circumspect about buying American stock. And borrowing money from the rest of the world, they'll say, well, maybe we'll lend you money, but we probably won't lend you in the large volumes that we're lending you the money today, and we want a higher risk premium. So as a result of that, you're going to have weakness in the stock market, a big rise in interest rates simply because the foreign capital won't be there to fuel our bond markets, and that will take an already weakened economy, weakened by a terrorist attack, and weaken it still further as a result of higher interest rates and a weakening of the financial markets. So the fact is that we're really looking into the next decade, and if you project out some of these trends, they could be under an adverse circumstance such as a terrorist attack, or not even that, even another disastrous hurricane or a pandemic. We're going to be in a much more difficult financial position to deal with any type of national emergency unless we're able to find some way of shoring up our national security capability, our homeland defense capability, for instance, and finding some way of making sure that entitlements become more sustainable so they don't suck money out of all other aspects of the government budget. And I think that's going to be an enormous challenge for the next president. So on that note, having sort of taken you through a half-hour tour of the book, I'm very happy to answer questions, or if there are any dissenting opinions, I'm very happy to hear those as well. So please feel free. Yes, Bob, do you want to start?
I was just going to say.
Oh, thank you very much.